All right, Bob, here we are in that great corpus of prophetic poems that people traditionally call Second Isaiah. It's their major contribution, although this editing that we've looked at earlier in the book is theirs as well. We've been talking. Let's just look in this section right at chapter 40 itself, because so many themes of this great corpus of Second Isaiah come up here. Chapter 40 begins with these words, comfort, comfort. If you look at the Hebrew, it's not just vocative nouns being thrown around. It's not an individual being asked to provide comfort, but it's a plural command, a plural imperative in the Hebrew. God is commanding a group to provide comfort to this community in exile in Babylonia. Who are these agents of God? Who's being addressed by these commands?
To be honest, I don't have a clue. The tradition, the interpretive tradition, long ago recognized the problem, which is masked by most modern translations that don't tell you anything about the plurals. They appear here, and they appear later on in these imperatives as well. In the wilderness, prepare a way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. What we can say about it is that more than one person is being addressed here. So this is a community of some sort. And various people have tried to guess just who it might be. The simplest assumption, I think, is that it is in fact the community of interpreters. It is the community of the second Isaiah. It is the people who treasure this text and are trying to interpret it. So suddenly, from being an object of interpretation for the later community, the text has turned on the interpreters.
Yeah.
And the interpreters are now the object of address in the text. So whenever the community of faith, whether Jewish or Christian, reads this text, it suddenly is speaking directly to them in whatever time they find their way.
Do you think that this community that's to provide comfort in the midst of the suffering of exile, is it in some way identified with the remnant? I ask because if you go back, we looked in a previous section at chapters 10 to 12 of Isaiah, and there's this prophetic prophecy of a remnant being comforted by God.
It certainly is, and the more we read through the chapter, it becomes clear that the community being addressed is one that is close to being wiped out, and that certainly meets the definition of the remnant. So if we look at what the people are being asked to do, they are supposed to speak to Jerusalem tenderly and cry to her that she has served her term. Notice the judicial language that's being used here. This is being spoken of as serving penalty for crime, and certainly that fits the definition of how Israel understood its exile in Babylon. Just as earlier Jerusalem and Judah suffered by means of the Assyrian invasion for past sins they had committed, so also the people in exile understand their present position in the same light. So they are understanding their punishment in Babylon, in exile, in just the same way the earlier community understood its punishment at the hands of the Assyrians. So Assyrians, Babylonians, in the way in which this interpretive tradition moves, they all function in the same way.
Do you think that the suffering can all be accounted for as punishment? I mean, the whole notion of the people of God suffering, I think, is very relevant for people's lives. We all wonder why we suffer.
Yeah, it is, and the remnant is characterized repeatedly as suffering. We noticed that earlier on. Being part of the remnant does not exclude the community that is part of the remnant from undergoing the judgment. It's a very strange kind of judgment.
But it's almost as if they suffer more than just the judgment. What's this stuff about double
suffering? That is a really
suffering?
Subtle point, and none of the commentators seem to have a really good explanation for that. Notice that it says, Jerusalem has paid her penalty. She has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sin. That's been a problem to interpreters. They don't understand what that means. There is leftover suffering that has gone on, which either has to be written down as or understood as unjust suffering.
I mean, God does get mad at Assyria for way overextending the role of instrument of judgment. In the arrogance, Assyria just takes things.
But again, that makes the point. There seems to be an appropriate amount of judgment that goes along with every sin, and the point being made here very subtly is Jerusalem seems to have suffered more than that. Now, we're going to get some very explicit treatment of that later on in chapters 52 and 53 with the servant. So it may be that the same understanding is operating here, that the extra suffering of Jerusalem is for some other purpose, that it is perhaps redemptive for sin that the city itself did not commit.
Maybe I should just say something about the servant, because it's going to take a little getting used to. There's this figure in this central corpus of 2nd Isaiah that people call the servant of the Lord or the suffering servant, and interpreters through the centuries have just shaken their heads and spilled jar after jar of ink trying to figure out who this person is. But certainly in the great poem in chapters 52 and 53, this figure is suffering, and it's not because of any judgment due to him, but it's on behalf of others. So, is this kind of a foreshadowing of that?
Or the other is a foreshadowing of this. It's not exactly clear, but the two passages may inform each other in the way they are understanding the role of suffering in the community itself. It's interesting that here you have these anonymous voices crying out, the first to prepare the way of the Lord back to Zion, to return to Zion. And then in verse 6 we have this anonymous voice crying out, and an I answers this. Mm-hmm. And the I is probably the prophet, whose response to the voice is, well, what shall I cry? And then an excuse for not doing anything. All people are grass, their constancy is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades. When the breath of the Lord blows upon it, surely the people is grass. Yeah. This is a reflection of Isaiah's oracle during the Assyrian crisis, which talked about the Assyrians coming through and the people are going to be like the grass that withers in the summer heat.
I think that's very interesting.
And now it's the Babylonians.
Yeah. I mean, there's echoes of the prophet's original call. When Isaiah first encountered God high and lifted up in the temple, he was asked to go on a mission, and his response was, well, I'm unclean and my people are unclean. There's no way. Here's another objection
example of the same thing.
Along the same lines. What is frail humanity to do given how puny and mortal and finite we are? And that, I think, is one of the central spiritual mysteries and wonders of 2nd Isaiah, is that it's the very frailty and finitude of human beings that is the source of their true strength. Because if you recognize your frailty, then you can channel this word of God that's working God's purposes through history. And essentially that's what the Hebrew parallelism says in verse 7. Yeah, people are grass does wither. But parallel to that idea, the flip side of that idea is that the word of our God stands forever, and there's no way you can stop it.
In the translation we're using, there are no quotation marks around verse 8, but this has got to be the divine answer to the prophet's effort, again, as in chapter 6, of escaping the divine commission. What can I do? All flesh is grass. And God's response is, yes, indeed, the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. The promise that has been made is going to be fulfilled, and there's nothing that human beings can do about it. This leads directly to the commission, not to a group, but yet to another messenger, and that is the personified city of Jerusalem itself, which has suffered for its own redemption. And that's going to raise a really interesting question later on when we begin to look at the idea of redemption. and what the prophet understands by it. It's another one of those crucial themes that pops up from time to time in 2nd Isaiah, and we will look at that in later sections.